Good morning. We want to welcome you to the South Carolina Ag Disruptors webinar series. This is our monthly series that focuses on topics and things that could have a significant impact on South Carolina agriculture. So I'm Kevin Burkett of the Clemson Extension Agribusiness Team and joined by my colleague and co-host Scott Mickey, also of the Clemson Extension Agribusiness Team. And so for this month, we asked Dr. Blake Brown of NC State to come on and speak with us. We saw Dr. Brown recently at the Executive Farm Management Program, which Dr. Brown created, and it's a great program in and of itself. So we would encourage you to check that out if you're not already familiar with it. But at that program, he gave us a talk about a cultured meat plant that was um, starting to be built in North Carolina, and it was really interesting. And as we got to thinking about it, he said that that's really a disruptor in every sense of the word, and felt like it was a very interesting topic to hear about and to think about. So felt like it was a great fit for our webinar. Um, Dr. Brown has had a long career at NC State, and earlier this year retired, and so he's now professor emeritus, but was willing to come on board with us today and share some information and some of his expertise. So we greatly appreciate that, and you should be able to submit questions and things through the chat. Sometimes the settings on Zoom, I think, in the past have um, we updated that to where you can submit questions. Dr. Brown, I don't know if you have a preference if we hold questions to the end or anything like that, or if you want me to maybe just interrupt you as things come through. But I imagine the participants might have a question or two as we go through today's discussion. So
Yeah, it's fine either way. We can do questions as they come up, and we'll just make this informal and let them ask questions as we go through it. And of course, if there are questions at the end, I'll be glad to do those as well. So,
okay. But no, we again we do appreciate you coming on with us. Looks it should be your screen. Your screen looks good and is ready to go. So with that, I'll just turn it back over to you.
all right, well, we'll get started then. Thank you, Kevin, for having me today. This is a really interesting topic. I've been following it for about 3 or 4 years now. Lab grown meat, and they don't like to call it that. They like to call it cultured meat, is not something brand new. We've been able to do this for decades. It's usually only been done in the laboratory for scientific studies and those kinds of things. It's very expensive to do. It certainly was not feasible from a commercial scale. But in recent years, we've seen a number of companies. In fact, there are dozens of companies now that have been trying to industrialize this and take it up to a larger scale. A lot of this has to do with poultry. That seems to be one of the simplest meats for them to start with. And it's kind of interesting. When I was doing some research on this, I found this quote from Winston Churchill in 1931. He said, "We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium." So over 80 years ago, or really, I guess over 90 years ago, right? So over 90 years ago, Winston Churchill's statement almost seems prophetic now, because that's exactly what these companies are trying to do at the moment. And there is a website where you can go and learn more about this. This is a website of companies who want to try to do cultured meat. And so, as well as plant-based meat. And we've all heard a lot about Beyond Meat, which is a vegan product. That company has had lots of problems in the last year. The vegan products have had very mixed success. They certainly have not taken off. And I think the big reason for that is that they really probably don't taste enough like meat. And the other problem with that is that, they're advertising a vegan option. Well, vegans are probably already used to not eating meat, so they really don't care whether they have a vegan hamburger or not. And people that are okay with eating meat don't see a lot of reason to eat vegan. So that experiment has not fared extremely well. But this Good Food Institute also represents those companies that are trying to do cultured meat. And cultured meat is a lot different. It is not a vegan product. It is actual meat. For example, chicken breasts that are being produced this way. They start that process with chicken breast muscle cells. And so they propagate those and grow them in a laboratory condition, and they grow chicken breasts. So it is literally chicken breast, the same composition as you would see in a live chicken. So the question is, does it taste the same? I don't know exactly the answer to that, but that's one of the big ones. I'm told it does. I've been following, like I said, this for about 3 or 4 years, and about 3 years ago, this company called Just Eats, which is a San Francisco-based company. They do a vegan egg product, but they also have a subsidiary called Good Meat. And that's the web page you're looking at right now from Good Meat. It was marketed to restaurants in Singapore about 3 years ago. They received permission to do that. They have a factory there that is producing this cultivated chicken or cultured chicken. And so they're basically selling chicken breast meat from this factory. According to their website, it's not quite profitable yet, but they're getting closer to having it being cost effective. And it has been well received by consumers in Singapore. FDA and USDA have regulatory processes for this. FDA has to clear companies in the US before they can market it here. They started doing that in November. They cleared the first company, gave them permission to market a cultivated chicken meat product. And I think there's a lot more companies in line. It's interesting, when I was in DC with the executive branch, I guess 1819, USDA and FDA were kind of having a little tiff over who was going to get to control this or regulate it. And so they were thinking about it way back then. And turns out, I think they will both have parts in regulating this product, whether it's poultry or any other meat product. This really piqued my interest back in December when I learned that a company called Believer Meats had broke ground in eastern North Carolina. They broke ground in Wilson County, which is just about 40 miles east of Raleigh. And this plant purports that they will, upon completion, be able to produce 10,000 metric tons of chicken meat per year. And I think they'll probably start off with chicken breast meat. That's the highest value cut. I mean, that's not anything like the amount of broiler meat we produce in North Carolina, but it is equivalent to the amount of breast meat that would be produced in our third largest broiler county. So you want to think about this, it could replace essentially production, if it's successful, of one of our largest broiler producing counties in North Carolina. So it's fairly significant. And what's really significant about this is this company, which is an Israeli company, basically believes that they have developed the process to bring this to an industrial scale and make it cost competitive with chicken meat produced from live chickens. So we'll see. But if it is successful, it could be a big disruptor for eastern North Carolina. And there's lots of reasons for using poultry. I mean, I think one reason in particular is that, if you're doing chicken meat, chicken breast meat, it's kind of a homogeneous muscle. And it's probably one of the easier ones that you can produce using this kind of process. The other reason is, as you see here, poultry consumption here in the U.S. continues to just go up, up, up. And if we look back over the decades, way beyond this current decade that I have up here, you would see that has been a trend constantly. Beef consumption per capita has declined, and in the last recent decade, it's kind of leveled out. Pork consumption tends to continue to increase slowly, and turkey production has been about level over the years. But broilers, chicken meat, really has continued to escalate. So there's growing demand, and we see expansion in our poultry industry. We see expansion in our broiler industry here in North Carolina. We had a big expansion 5 to 10 years ago, and now we're having another expansion of that poultry industry. So this topic is very timely, especially for a state like North Carolina or South Carolina, where broiler production is very, very important. And you'll see here where the largest broiler states are. I believe Alabama, no, Georgia tops the list in terms of broiler production, followed by Alabama, followed by Arkansas, and then followed by North Carolina. But you can see that South Carolina has fairly large broiler production as well, 249 million head in 2021. So it's a very significant source of income for farmers in the Southeast. And you can see that most of that production is concentrated in the southern states of the U.S. So you kind of ask, well, what kind of boxes does this check, or what kind of things would this eliminate for poultry producers, for consumers, for anybody involved in this chain of chicken meat? Well, one, it would reduce animal welfare concerns. I mean, that's a big issue that any confinement, livestock, or poultry industry deals with right now. Obviously, the broiler industry, that's one of the things that they have to deal with from certain groups. It would probably be more feed efficiency. It would probably be more feed efficient as well, because you're only supporting just the growth of the muscle that you eat rather than a skeleton and a digestive system, feathers and skin and all those other things. It would reduce some of the waste management issues. Now, this process does produce waste, but probably not as much as you have produced from contract poultry production. And then from an integrator standpoint, there would be no need for thousands of contracts with farmers. You know, it would basically be factory production rather than working with farmers. Does it have a lower cost of production? Well, that's the big question. And that's the real question that we look at this going forward is, will it actually be cost competitive with chicken meat produced in a traditional way? The other one is it more environmentally friendly? And this one was a little surprising when I started doing research on this. Not necessarily. Depends on where they source their electricity. Evidently, there's a lot of electricity used in this process in the factories that produce this or the labs. And so it's only more environmentally friendly if they source their electricity from an environmentally friendly source. So interesting, that's definitely not a definite. Is it safe? Well, probably the FDA has cleared it, but I think that's exactly one of the things that consumers are going to look at is they're going to wonder whether or not it's safe. And so the next issue, consumer acceptance, which frankly, in my view, is the biggest issue that they face. Will they be able to alleviate consumer concerns with food safety? I mean, certainly some groups are going to call it Franken meat. It's probably going to face a lot of opposition, just like GMOs did. But if they get the taste and the price right, then consumers may treat it about like GMOs. They say that they might be concerned about it, but they generally don't pay very much attention when they go to the grocery store and buy products that are made from GMO products. So for me, I think the big thing is, do you alleviate consumer concerns about food safety regarding this? And does it taste like real chicken meat? And is it price competitive? If you hit those three things, then you know it could be a successful product. What do you feed cultured meat? Now, I've been doing some research on this. I haven't really got a lot of great answers, but here's some of the answers from more academic. I mean, it basically says that they have to provide a serum or medium that provides the same amino acids, glucose, vitamins, minerals, all those other growth factors that the blood supply in a real chicken provides. So they have to provide this in the factory in order for this to grow. It has to have something to eat. It has to have a medium with energy and protein and all the other growth factors in it. In fact, you know, some of the sources say that the cell culture is the most important factor in this technology. And so what do they make this serum out of? That's been the hard part to find out. I have learned that they do use quite a bit of animal products in making this serum, but they are trying to move away from animal products to pretty much, I guess, what you would say a vegan diet for these this cultured meat. And if that's the case, then we do have one quote from a scientist in Great Britain he says that it's more feed efficient because you're not having to support all those other systems besides the muscle, and a more feed efficient way of converting crops into meat. So in the end, if they are able to scale this up, I would think that they're going to have to look at using something like soybeans and corn as a base medium to feed it. But I haven't found that out for sure. In fact, I just got off the phone this morning with the Biotechnology Center, thinking that they would probably know. The North Carolina Biotechnology Center was very instrumental in bringing this lever meats to North Carolina. And at least the person I talked to did not really know. So we'll have to wait and see. This is an important factor because if this is successful, and I granted that's a big if it is successful, then it won't only affect poultry farmers, it'll affect corn and soybean farmers as well. Because in the Carolinas, we receive a premium, a positive basis over the Midwest corn prices, for example, because we are a corn deficit area and we have to bring a lot of our corn either in by ship or bring it in by rail. So if this becomes the dominant production technology, then it's going to use less feed, but it's going to have feed from something. But we'll see. But this is one of the areas that I hope to find out a little bit more about. I haven't been able to talk to one of the company people yet, but it'll be interesting to see what that serum or that medium is made out of. And global meat production is on the rise. And you think about this globally. I know that China is thinking about this. I mean, they have a huge population. Their population has been eating more meat, as have been a lot of other developing countries. And so China is also one of the top meat producing nations, as you'll see here. And they just went through African swine fever, where they lost a lot of their swine herd and are now trying to build it back. But during that problem with African swine fever, pork prices went up, and a lot of Chinese learned to eat chicken. And so it sounds like the Chinese government is looking at this probably, first of all, in chicken production, as you would kind of expect, because there was a survey not long in one of their largest cities where they were surveying consumers about their attitude towards cultured meats. So interesting. Countries that have large populations to feed and where people want to move to more meat in their diet. If this were successful, then it might be a technology that a lot of those countries looked at. So the big question is this a paradigm shift for the meat industry? I don't know. I think it's something, given the importance of poultry production in North and South Carolina, that we have to look at and watch out for. Will it be successful? I think, again, the three factors you look at: can you alleviate consumer concern about food safety? Probably. Does it taste like chicken meat coming from a live chicken? Probably. I mean, it technically is chicken meat. And probably the most questionable of the three big factors that I think are really important is, will it be cost competitive with chicken produced in a traditional way? I mean, chicken, for one reason for its success, is not only the health part of it and the taste, but also just because it's fairly inexpensive to grow, especially relative to meats like beef or even pork. And so it fits into a consumer's diet in a number of ways. It has a healthy choice, it's an inexpensive choice of protein, and in most cases, people like the taste of it. So if you hit those three things, then yes, this could be a paradigm shift for the poultry industry. And so when we think about this, what are the takeaways in terms of, whether this may go forward or not? Well, as I mentioned, food safety, taste, cost, those are the big ones. If we pass those hurdles, then consumers will likely be consuming this, and we'll see more of these operations come into existence. The biggest issue may be perceptions about food safety. We'll have to see whether they can alleviate consumer concerns about that. It checks a lot of boxes for livestock and poultry integrators. Can they move to other meats? Well, yeah, they can. In fact, the company in Singapore, Good Meat, is actually trying to cultivate Wagyu beef now. Now, I'm a beef cattle producer, and that kind of concerns me. Can they actually propagate Wagyu beef in the lab and grow it that way? I think more complex muscles like well-marbled beef is more difficult. And I think, complex cuts like bacon, pork bellies would be more difficult too. And of course, when you look at the hog industry, which is the other really important industry in North Carolina, then essentially, the pork belly is the most expensive cut from the hog industry. And so if you want to replicate that, you're going to have to learn how to grow bacon. Can they do that? I don't know. It's another technology question. But if it's successful, it will be a paradigm shift in the poultry industry. It'll be a bigger shift than when we shifted in poultry from small scale production on independent farms to vertically integrated production. And that happened in the 60s and 70s for poultry. And then we saw that happen with hogs in the 80s and 90s. This would be an even more dramatic shift, especially for states like North and South Carolina. So if you saw that shift, how long would it take to do that? Well, I don't know. I don't know how quickly this technology can advance. I don't know how quickly they can get it into the hands of consumers and scale it up industrial wise. But if it's successful, my guess is that you could see in 10 to 20 years a shift away from farm production of poultry. And think about what that would do for North and South Carolina. It would be a huge change in our production. And like I said, we're seeing right now a current expansion in poultry production in North Carolina, and I think to some extent also in South Carolina. And this is after we had a major expansion 5 to 10 years ago. And our expansion, even if you set this cultured meat issue completely aside, I'm a little concerned about some of the things I hear from our current expansion. Of course, now when you decide you want to produce broilers for one of the integrators, essentially you are building facilities that are going to cost probably between $2 and $3 million. Typically, we think of the life of those facilities as being 10 to 20 years. Most often, they have been financed on loans with terms of 10 to 15 years. But one thing that concerns me now is I'm hearing about loan terms of 20 years. And I'll tell you why that concerns me. A couple of reasons. One, anytime I talk to farm families, especially in Eastern North Carolina, and I suspect it's kind of the same in Eastern South Carolina as well, if they're wanting to bring another child into the operation, if they're wanting to figure out how to maybe phase out something like tobacco and bring in more farm income, one of the options I hear talked about most frequently is, well, what about if we built some broiler houses? And I'm not saying that's a bad option, but it concerns me when we have lenders that may be financing these for 20 years. Because in my 30-year career around poultry industry, most of the time, after about 10 years, the integrator will come to the farmer and say, if you want to continue to produce with us, you need to make some renovations to your houses. And they might be major renovations. So if you're on a 20-year loan, then in 10 years, you've not even paid off half your principal yet. And your company is asking you, says, if you want to continue to grow, you got to make these renovations. So you've got to go back to your lender and take out another loan for renovations when you don't even have your houses half paid for at that point. If you're on a 10 to 15-year loan term, you might have them paid off, or at least be a lot closer to having them paid off than on a 20-year term. So that concerns me in general. But if this came about, if cultured meat was successful, then there would be some big concerns if you're depending on having to earn income from this expensive asset for about 20 years. Because if the technology is successful, I could see it really causing a major shift in 10 to 20 years. It'll basically depend on how long it takes them to convince consumers that this tastes good, is safe, and they can walk into their Costco or grocery store and buy it at the same price that they could for other chicken meat. So that's where I would leave this at. I would say I do not know whether it's going to be successful. I mean, we've had lots of technologies that have tried and haven't made the degrade in terms of consumer acceptance. The vegan products are certainly one of those products. In tobacco, you know, we were all worried about e-cigarettes a few years ago. Now we're talking about heat not burn, but none of those technologies have been a close enough substitute to the real product to make consumers switch over. Will this one be? Let's wait and see. But I guarantee you, you know, as important as poultry is in the Carolinas, we better keep a close watch on it. And if you're thinking about making one of these major investments of $2 or $3 million, and you've got to get money from this thing for 20 years, you need to at least think about what the ramifications of this kind of shift would be and what your exit strategy would be should something like this happen. So with that, Kevin, I'll turn it back over to you. And if there are any questions, I would be glad to take them at this point. So.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for kind of the overview there. Could you talk just a little bit about the plant that is going in North Carolina?
Sure. As I mentioned, it's an Israeli company. They supposedly have scaled up production in Israel. That's their pilot plant in Israel. Now they're bringing this to the U.S. under the name Believer Meats or Believe Meats, I believe it was. And they are building this facility. They broke ground in December in Wilson County, about 40 miles east of Raleigh, right sort of in the middle of our livestock and poultry production. And they say when it is up and running, they should be able to produce 10,000 metric tons of chicken breast per year. They say that they have learned how to scale this up on an industrial scale and believe it will be cost competitive with chicken meat produced in a traditional way. They say it tastes just like chicken meat. So those are the things that are yet to be seen. As I mentioned earlier, if this were successful and they do produce 10,000 metric tons of chicken meat a year, it would be equivalent to the chicken breast meat produced in our third largest poultry county in North Carolina. So it's not insignificant. And, you know, there's, as I mentioned, lots of other companies that are asking FDA to give them permission to do this. Lots of people trying this, so we'll see. It's like any new technology. There are lots of bumps along the way. You know, I remember when they started making handheld calculators. I was in high school and I had to pay $75 for a calculator, and that was just the biggest deal. And now a calculator that would do the same kinds of things would probably cost you $1. You know, it's one of these cheap giveaway calculators that would do what my expensive $75 calculator would do in 1976. So we're getting lots of mixed reactions from analysts on this. You know, some say, oh, it'll never happen. Consumers will never eat this stuff. They'll think it's fracking meat. They can't get the cost down. So there's lots of naysayers, and maybe they'll be right. Frankly, as somebody that is close to the farm, I kind of hope they are right. But every new technology has had these kind of naysayers about it. And eventually the industry has figured out how to, in many of these cases, bring that technology down in cost and upgrade, you know, the effectiveness or the quality or the desirability of the technology. So I'm going to reserve judgment. I'm not going to be a naysayer. I'm not going to be one that says, hey, it will definitely be successful in the future. But I'm going to say this, we need to keep a close watch on it. And I think this factory in Wilson that we talked about, I believe is supposed to be up and running sometime in 2024. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm certainly going to keep an eye on it and try to learn more about this technology as it proceeds.
And would you know, are they planning facilities in other parts of the country, or North Carolina is the sole one for right now, or maybe there's another company planning one somewhere else?
I think there are plans. I don't know of any specific groundbreaking or startups of factories. This is the first industrial scale factory in the U.S. to grow cultured meats. I do know there's lots of other companies interested in this and filing with FDA for approval to market their products. So I would have to assume that they have some fairly concrete plans of how they will build facilities to produce this wind, themselves. So I would be surprised if we don't see groundbreaking on a number of these facilities in the next 2 or 3 years. I'd just say one of the other differences in this and say vegan meat production. Vegan meat production, you look at Beyond Meats, they had lots of kind of celebrity investments because, these are vegan people to do this. This one is different. If you look at the investors, they're companies like ADM, which is, of course, a large grain merchant. There are companies like Tyson, which is the largest poultry integrator in the United States. There are some unknown investors, and I guarantee you that some of those will probably be other meat producers. So unlike the vegan product, you have the production side of poultry investing in this, looking at it very closely. And as I said, it checks a lot of boxes for them. So if the consumer accepts it, then the production side is already there. And that certainly was not the case with vegan meats. It's very different. It's kind of sexy and glossy and having celebrities invest in it. But the problem was, I don't think that they really looked at who the consumer was that was going to buy their product, at least not closely enough. The consumer they're shooting for here is, this is chicken meat, and it's going to go to consumers that eat chicken meat. And again, that's the food safety, taste, and cost issue. So.
And we did have a question come in. How are existing manufacturers doing with profitability so far? So, and I guess that wouldn't be necessarily anything in the U.S. since this is maybe the first one, but that'd be maybe any foreign that are currently doing.
Yeah, and the one that I mentioned was the company in Singapore, which is Good Meats is the name of the company. It's a subsidiary of Just Eats, which is a San Francisco-based company. In that case, at least that company reports that they are not profitable yet. They have scaled it up in Singapore, but they believe that they now have the process down. If they continue to scale it up, it will be cost competitive. It will be profitable at cost competitive levels. So that's about all the information we have right now. Of course, obviously, Believe Meats thinks that they will be cost competitive if they scale it up to this 10,000 metric tons a year. So.
Would you know of any university research that's currently ongoing in this area?
There's university research on cultured meat. I looked, and there may be some, but I have not yet found any, say, College of Agriculture or Poultry Science Department that has looked at this, or Food Science Department that's really looking at this in depth. Now, there may be, and I'm just not aware of that, but it seems that most of the research along these lines has been done on a private basis, or perhaps by universities that are not necessarily agricultural related. So, but there may be some somewhere, and I'm just not aware of it. So. I would think it'd be a good thing for, say, for example, a food science department to look at, because I know their food science department at North Carolina State University does a lot of work in collaboration with the poultry science department. And I would hope that this is on the radar anyway. It needs to be.
Yeah, certainly. And as you covered, I mean, it seems like it could be a significant disruptor to the industry. There was a question, do you know why they picked Wilson County in North Carolina?
I do not. I know that our Economic Development Authority in North Carolina worked with them closely to get them to North Carolina. It's a little interesting. Wilson County is while they're right in the heart of our hog and poultry industry, they really don't have a lot of hogs and poultry themselves. And in fact, I believe several years ago, the Wilson County Commissioners rejected a poultry company that wanted to build a processing plant in Wilson. Because just over the line in Nash County, well, over the line in several of the counties around them, there's a lot of poultry and hogs, and there are processors. But I don't know why they picked Wilson County, except that, North Carolina did recruit this plant, and obviously Wilson was excited about it coming there because it supposedly will create 600 jobs. And a lot of these jobs will be fairly good paying jobs as well. So.
And I think you may have mentioned this, but some of the funders for that were like Tyson's and things like that, correct?
That's right. Tyson was listed as one of the investors. ADM, grain merchant, is listed as another investor. And then there are some unnamed investors. But if you think about this, you could see why a poultry integrator would be very interested in the future of this. It would change their business dramatically. And if you're behind the curve, if this is actually successful, then your poultry company might not make it. And so, JBS, which is the largest meat company in the world, and their poultry company in the U.S. is Pilgrim's Pride. Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, we have all the major poultry companies in the Carolinas. They're here. And I suspect they will all be looking carefully at this. But you have to understand their risk to changing the production system is minimized by the fact that they don't own any of the production facilities for chickens. The farmers own those, and the farmers contract with these companies to grow them. So the farmers are holding the financial risk of losing the current production system. I think that's one reason we have to be especially careful about this. For a poultry integrator, yeah, it's going to change the way they process chickens. It's going to do away with the parts of that factory where they eviscerate and get rid of the offal. One question though is, what about all those parts that we don't pay as much for here? We pay premiums for chicken breast and wings. That's what we like here in the U.S. And so a lot of the thigh meat goes to third world countries. A lot of the offal goes to third world countries. Chicken feet on a weight basis are fairly valuable. They go to places like Asia, especially China. So what about these other products if you start just growing the high value cuts? Would you grow boneless wings? Because that's a high value cut. Clearly, they're all starting out with chicken breast. I mean, that's a logical one to start with. But what about the market for dark meat? You could certainly probably cultivate and grow that meat, but that's got to be even more cost competitive than the high value cuts like chicken breast. So there's lots of unanswered questions about those kinds of issues before we see this industry becoming successful.
And one other follow up was, could you say how much the investment in Wilson County was again?
I don't know how much the investment is, and I can't remember if that was published or not. But obviously, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, to build this factory. But I don't recall right off the top of my head if I've seen that or not. So.
Okay. And if there are no other questions, I did put the link to Believer Meats in the chat, and you're welcome to submit any further questions if you have any. I don't see any right offhand. I was also going to put a link to the Executive Farm Management Program into the link. So if you haven't heard about that, that might interest you, and you might be interested in checking that out. So it's finished for this year for 2023, but that'll be a program that you could sign up for next year. And again, Dr. Brown created that program, and then Scott is also heavily involved in kind of a collaborative program there. But and that's where we heard Dr. Brown speak on this, which again we thought was very interesting and could have a significant impact on the industry. So if there are no further questions, we don't necessarily have to stay on the webinar, but we do want to thank you again Dr. Brown, for being on with us, and given that you're retired, basically spending personal time with us. But it did feel like this was a significant topic to think about and to cover, and it will be really interesting to see kind of what happens going forward.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me, and we'll keep an eye on this and see what happens.
So thanks again, everyone, for participating. We do have a webinar scheduled for April 19th for next month. We have one presenter scheduled for right now. We'll probably have another one, but we have the Master Food Preserver Program through Clemson Extension. We'll have someone present on that. And we will probably be continually adding to the schedule as we go throughout the year. So we know that's scheduled for next month, and we'll keep you updated on additional topics and speakers as we move forward. But again, thank you, Dr. Brown, and hope everyone has a good afternoon, and we'll see you next month.